This is my very first MAGFest, so I'm having a fantastic time. I'm really happy to be here with all you guys, and saw some amazing concerts and met some amazing people, and now we're going to do this panel. So thank you all for coming. My name is Zach. I am a composer based in New York City. I compose music for Just Cause 3 and Just Cause 4, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I work out of my apartment in Queens and in my studio in Brooklyn, which is called You Two Can Woo, which I own with 4 other business partners who are also my very good friends. Okay, so that's enough about me. Today we're going to talk about music aesthetic in general. We're going to deconstruct the Just Cause 4 creative brief. We're going to build out the Just Cause 4 musical aesthetic from the creative brief. And then finally, we're going to talk about how the musical aesthetic adapts to support all the different types of gameplay that you would find in the game. So I'm very excited to talk about adaptive aesthetic gradients, but I want to start by asking a pretty dumb question, which is, what is adaptive music? This is semi-rhetorical, so I'll just answer it for myself. Obviously, adaptive music is music that adapts, right? But that begs the question, well, what is it adapting to? And that's actually kind of a much more interesting question. And so a slightly more complicated answer to that question is, adaptive music is music that is in a real-time feedback loop with an experiencer. And in a video game, that experiencer might be a player who is interacting through the game engine with an audio engine, and then the audio engine is spitting music back through the game engine back to the player who's listening to it, and along with the other things in the game is adapting and reacting. Then that information goes back through, hits the audio changes, the player changes, the audio changes, and that's the loop. And that may seem like a brand new, interesting computer-based idea, but adaptive music has been around for a very long time. Anybody here play solo? Anybody here play music out in front of other people? So if you've ever taken a solo, you probably know that that solo, while you may have come up with some ideas beforehand, is in part determined by how you felt that day, what the audience is doing. If the audience seems really into your solo, you might continue to take a longer solo. If the audience seems like they're not interested, you might cut it short. If you're having a bad day, you may take like a quiet solo in a loud song, or if you're having a really good day, you may take a loud solo and a quiet song, whatever. If you spent time playing in jam bands like I did in my 20s, you might, as a group, improvise together to form like a climactic moment. So in that moment, you are adapting as a band to the feeling of the audience, to know when you're hitting that adaptive climactic moment, you are adapting to hit those points. Anybody DJ? So if you've DJ'd like I have and noticed that nobody is dancing to the music that you're playing, you're probably going to change your set list in real time to maybe you play a song and all of a sudden everybody comes out on the floor. It's like, okay, I'm going to continue to play that. So that's technically adaptive music as well. Theater and dance is another great example. Anybody here play in musical theater in the pit or anything like that, or in a dance pit? So a vamp, right? Why is there a vamp in a song? Well, a performer might need to walk across the stage. This is spatialized performances, and time is needed for people to move back and forth into different places. So a vamp is adaptive. The music director or keyboardist or whoever is in charge is going to cue the end of the vamp when that other human gets to where they need to be on the stage. These are all forms of adaptive music. The interesting thing is that all these forms of adaptive music involve humans interacting with other humans. But video game music relies on computers and programming to create adaptive potentials and boundaries outside of what is available between humans in real time. And as composers, it's our job to define those boundaries and create music which interacts and adapts seamlessly to support all gameplay scenarios. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the power of adaptive music with the aid of computers and programming would be something like, let's say you are in your jazz band taking a solo, and all of a sudden your solo is going so well that you want an orchestra to start playing behind you. Well, in real life, of course, that would be next to impossible. But in video game music, if you have the adaptive potential of an orchestra, either pre-recorded or some way to generate that, you can absolutely have an orchestra come in behind your solo, and it wouldn't be a problem at all. So that is the interesting new thing that you can do. And we did a lot of it in Just Cause 4. Has anyone here played Just Cause 4? It's okay if you haven't. You have? Wow. Awesome. It's a really good game if you haven't played it. Just Cause 4 is an over-the-top action-adventure game, and I embolden game in my notes here because it is definitely a game in capital G. The franchise is from Avalanche Studios, which is a Swedish company. The franchise is about 15 years old, and there are 4 games in the series. This is the 4th, obviously. The hallmarks of the franchise are physics-based destruction, so most of the game involves blowing stuff up. Anybody played Just Cause 3 or 2 or 1? Okay, so you guys know. Right, so the goal of the game in many respects is to blow up stuff, and the main character has this very versatile grappling hook that he uses to get around for traversal. And the other important point to remember is that Just Cause 4 is intentionally ridiculous. It is designed to be as ridiculous as possible and fun and joyful, and that's always kind of in my mind when I was working on it. So before we get into it, I just want to play a video of some of the more like epic, ridiculous moments from the game so you can get a sense of kind of the scope of the music. So here's a video of epic ridiculousness from Just Cause 4.
I will find you.
No. No, you won't.
He does find him. So, thanks. So, that's just a small snippet of what was about 6 hours of in-game music, plus about 45 minutes of music for the DLCs. And when accounting for all deliverables, there's about 9 hours of mixed audio in the game. So with such a large and varied amount of music, we needed a system to guide how the music would support all the different characters, themes, and storylines, and how it would adapt to all the different styles of gameplay in such a big game. So before diving into how we came up with that system, I want to talk about an approach to composition that informs my process. Okay. When McDonald's launched the Big Mac in 1968, one of the world's first branded hamburgers, it came with a unique flavor called special sauce. My question to you all is, what is special sauce? And the answer is Thousand Islands dressing. So the point is that special sauce is not special, but the intent of using it is what makes it special. So you can imagine thousands of hours of research went into this decision, labor hours of proof of concept and focus groups and testing different things out. And the choice of special sauce being Thousand Island dressing is what makes the Big Mac a unique branded hamburger. So as composers, one of our jobs, just like the focus groups of the Big Mac creators, is to have an incredibly deep systemic understanding of overarching concepts, and then compose music which supports those concepts, whether they're our own concepts or they're the concepts that we are building in collaboration with others. So we need to be the executive chefs of our own music and kind of put everything together on the highest level and the deepest understanding. So when we're talking about special sauce in music, we're talking about aesthetic. So let's briefly just go through some ideas about general musical aesthetics and how they relate to like a unique way of building out the sound of a game. So the traditional methods are melody, harmony, instrumentation, and the genre. So melody, I think we can all think of, if you need to think of a modern melody that kind of sums up a concept or an idea, you don't have to look much farther than John Williams and John Williams' film scores, but you can go back to his reference points like Tchaikovsky and Strauss through the lens of Korngold and all those guys. They're using melody to perfectly sum up the idea of a character or of a film, of a plot point, of a story. And of course, those melodies can be deconstructed into leitmotifs and reconfigured and rearranged, and then all of a sudden you can build out an entire score just by reconfiguring melodies. Instrumentation, you can go all the way back to something like Monteverdi's Orfeo, the opera, the first opera, where he added trombones to the orchestra to represent the underworld in Hades, and trombones had never been in an orchestra up until that moment. So, and of course that goes all the way up until today, and Bernard Herrmann's scores of the idea of using strings for Psycho and things like that. So very clear instrumentation choices that define the sound of a film or of a concept. And associative harmony is an interesting one. Our brains have a unique ability to remember the quality of a harmony, and you can use that to play on people's emotions. So if anyone ever plays minor 1 chord to a major 2 chord, that always sounds to me like Batman '89. That's just what it sounds like, and it won't ever leave my head. But of course, Chopin was using those harmonies for a completely different associative reason back in the day. And there's lots of different, everyone has their own associations to harmonies that change over the years. And I also want to bring up functional harmony, because I've been thinking about this a lot recently, is tuning systems. Right now we are living in the equal temperament epoch, but if you think about different harmonic relationships and key choice back in the day, and when you're talking about just intonation, and certain harmonies you would choose would be extremely out of tune. And if you're playing on a keyboard instrument, they would just be out of tune. And then an orchestra could tune it, but there would be an inherent tension in trying to tune that harmony. You would be able to hear that tension. And I think we've kind of lost a little of that, but there's still something about functional harmony and tessitura, range, and how different harmonies within the tonal system can relate to each other to create this type of aesthetic special sauce. So once recording techniques, maybe 50 years ago or so, became a part of the composer's toolkit, once recorded music became the way that we expressed music, production became a musical parameter just as important as melody and harmony and instrumentation. And of course the Beatles were experimenting with that, and nowadays you can look to Hans Zimmer and his crew as people that use production as a musical parameter and aesthetic the same way someone might use melody. And Ludwig Göransson is doing something very similar with tools that are from his generation, our generation, modern hip-hop production techniques and things like that. And then even deeper, music as world building. So what I mean by this is when all these parameters come together and form a sound that is somehow supportive of the entire feel of a film or a game or a piece of media. So an example of that might be like the Arrival soundtrack. Anybody seen Arrival? So you're listening to the score to Arrival. You can't tell if it's the score. You can't tell if it's the sound design. You can't tell if it's the dialogue of the alien creatures. And that mystery and unknown is exactly what the movie's about. So in that way, the music is building the world of the film and supporting the world of the film using all these musical parameters together in a new way that builds out the aesthetic in a more three-dimensional way than you could do with just the visuals or the dialogue of the story. The Planet of the Apes is another great example where it feels like it's old and futuristic at the same time. The instruments, like an ancient instrument sound, but with like what was at the time very modern effects. And then The Godfather is another great example, I think, where you hear the solo trumpet, representing the aloneness of the Godfather, but then when he gets to Sicily, like it just opens up and this humongous melody comes in with the full orchestra, kind of the idea that his world is alone and then full, and how all those things all work together are expressed perfectly in the score. And when you talk about TV, you have so much more room to build because you have a lot more time. So I think great examples from TV are like the X-Files. I don't know if you guys are all X-Files heads, I certainly am. And the House of Cards theme feels like you're listening to the nightly news theme, but through some dark, shadowy portal, which perfectly represents the vibe of the show. And of course, Stranger Things kind of nailed it on the head. And then once you get into video games, the world building becomes even more important. So I think we can all think of video game scores that feel like they're a part of the world of the game. I think Red Dead Redemption is a great example. And I think Assassin's Creed 1 and 2 are incredible examples too of the idea that this game is through the lens of semi-futuristic technology looking down or accessing ancient ideas that's exactly expressed in the music. So you have these synthetic sounds kind of surrounding a core of either Near Eastern sounds or Italian Renaissance sounds, and I think it works perfectly. And then last but not least, technical special sauce, which is that video games can go one extra step and relate all these aesthetics to actual gameplay experiences via design and systems. So to summarize, understanding the intent behind creative decisions can lead to unique, immersive, and well-crafted scores. And in that spirit, let's talk about the creative brief for Just Cause 4, and then using all these different types of special sauce that we just went over, we can world build the music to support it. So, has anyone here seen a creative brief? Does anybody know what that is? So a creative brief is a document or some images, playlists of music that are put together to get everyone who's involved on a project on the same page ideologically. And it would often be put together by the person who is in charge of the project. If you're doing your own music, you can also do a creative brief for your own project, and it can help you to kind of summarize what you're trying to do. If you feel like you're stuck, something that could be really good is putting together a playlist reference or making some key art for yourself, or hiring someone to make key art for you that might inspire you to do something new. Understanding creative briefs as a composer is just as important in many respects as knowing how to write music. Because if you don't have a vocabulary to work with your collaborators, who are very often, more often than not musicians, then you're never going to get aligned. And if you're not aligned, you're never going to be able to build trust with your collaborators, and that's the goal. If you can build trust with your collaborators, you can make stronger musical choices and make decisions like that are pushing outside the boundaries, and people aren't coming from a reactive place, but instead they're coming from a place of positivity. So this is what we're going to talk about now, is my interpretation of the Just Cause 4 creative brief that was, as I was saying before, documents, images, artwork, videos, and reference playlists, things like that. So understanding the Just Cause 4 franchise in general is easy because this is not the first game in the franchise, so I was able to play the earlier games and kind of get into it. The first important thing to remember about Just Cause, as I was saying before, it's over-the-top action, and it's referencing the intentional ridiculousness of B action movies, like not great action movies, but action movies that tap into some core visceral intensity. So intentionally ridiculous dialogue and one-liners, cartoonish violence. So this is in no way, this is a very violent game, but it's not violent in a way that is gory or disgusting. It's more violent like in just a ridiculous cartoonish way. There's no love story, there's no self-reflection, there's no hugging. And for me, this all meant channeling the visceral energy of being 12. Now, I think we can all say that being 12 is probably not one of the best times in our lives, but there was, due to a lack of any frame of reference, there's like a purity of emotion of being 12. It was the first time I saw Terminator 2, I was like, that was the best. I still remember it. It was so fun. And True Lies, which is not a good movie, don't watch True Lies, but yes.
Did you look to these B-list action movies, like how they did their score, to maybe get inspiration for how you would do the score of those?
I listened to a lot of grindhouse cinema, and you put me on the spot, and I'm not going to remember the names of the people who did the scores, but like, absolutely no problem. It's I wish I was more prepared, but yeah, there's like a lot of like grindhouse cinema from the 70s and 80s that have like, they're like over the top action stuff with like cars driving off cliffs and things like that.
I was watching a YouTube video with the Spider-Man PS4 score. Mm-hmm. A lot of the methodology behind their soundtrack is very inspired by like Batman, superhero movies, the Marvel superhero movies. They use a lot of the same concepts.
That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. I think we were top down, just inspired. This is a historical inspiration for Just Cause 4, so we weren't talking about it specifically for this game directly, but of course it was on everybody's mind while we were working, for sure. Lost my place. Yes, being 12 years old. So don't watch True Lies, but remember what it felt like to just the purity of joy that you might feel watching a movie when you're 12, or the purity of hatred that you might feel watching a movie when you're 12. Whatever it is, imagine the purity of that emotion, and that was what I was trying to channel when I was working. So let's get into the characters. The first guy here on the left is Rico. He's the protagonist from all the Just Cause 4 games. He's known as a dictator removal specialist and an anti-hero. So he's certainly not a shining horse type of guy. To his right is the bad guys in this game, which is the Black Hand. They appear in other Just Cause 4 games, but they're much more fleshed out here. As you can see, this guy, I don't know if you can see because it's kind of dark, but this guy's kind of wearing a weird metal suit, and he's got this weird weapon on his hand there. The Black Hand has a super weapon, which is a very kind of 80s vibe. This Inhuman metal guy is a kind of 80s vibe. So there's sort of this retro-futurist 80s vibe to these guys. The machine-y, super weapon-y guys. Next to him is the Army of Chaos, which is the protagonist army. So in this art, this guy's wearing, he's super scrappy, right? Ragtag. He's got what appears to be a rollerblading pad on, and he's got like kind of half of a bulletproof vest, and he's covered in paint or something. So like, we know that the protagonist army is super scrappy, they're kind of DIY, and they're young. And then finally, on the far right is the land, the world that this game takes place, which is called Solis. So I'm listing Solis as a character in this game the same way that Princess Toadstool or Peach or whatever is in Mario 1, which is not a real character, but she is what the game is what you're fighting for at the end of the game. So at the end of this game, what you're fighting for is the world, which is a trope from RPGs and things like that. But I think it's important to list it as a character, and this character has, feelings and emotions on some level similar to a talking character in the game. Those characters are directly related to these themes. This is also from the creative brief. So technology and control. The oppressive dictator uses technology to oppress the people, and his method of doing that is the Black Hand. Freedom, reclaiming humanity for the people. So the Army of Chaos, the protagonist army, is fighting for their freedom from the oppressive dictator. There's a lost and forgotten culture that exists on this island. The people of Solis have lost their cultural identity and are fighting to get it back. And then finally, the force of nature is the one on the right there, and that one is the most interesting to me in some respects because it's an overarching theme. These weather events, like tornadoes and sandstorms and blizzards, exist physicalized on this island. You can interact with them. So they're part of the world of Solis, but they also act as a major plot MacGuffin, right? They're kind of like the point of the whole game. And on top of that, they are related to the protagonist, both through his backstory, and also there's a lot of relationships between Rico as a force of nature and a tornado as a force of nature. So there's a lot of crossover in the game about, well, what does this force of destruction mean? Who's in control of this force of destruction? How do we control this force of destruction? Should we control it? So I'm just going to write out here. Here's our themes that we just went over: technology and control, freedom, and the lost and forgotten culture, and then the overarching theme of force of nature. And then these are all related to these characters. So technology and control relates to the Black Hand, the bad guys. Freedom relates to the Army of Chaos, the good guys. The lost and forgotten culture relates to the world, Solis, what we're fighting for. And then above this whole thing, kind of relating to the entire spectrum of theme, is this force of nature, Rico, weather events idea. So now that we've identified these characters and theme groups, let's talk about how we can represent them musically in the soundtrack. Okay, you ready? Okay, I'm going to try to talk over the music, but if you can't hear me, just let me know. Okay, so the first thing I needed to do was represent this retro-futurist, dystopian, evil, bad guy, part robot, super weapon army. And knowing that Just Cause 4 doesn't take itself very seriously, what I decided to do, what we decided to do, was represent them with cheesy, tongue-in-cheek synths. So we're not talking about the big rolling Jupiters or CS80s or OBXs. A, I didn't have access to them or access to the money to buy them. But B, I didn't want to use those sounds because I felt like it would be taking them too seriously. So what I did have around me was a ton of prosumer synthesizers from the late 80s and early 90s, like the Korg DX8000, and my favorite one is the Korg 707, which I'm pretty sure has never been used in any professional media before, but the 707 uses a DX7 FM synthesizer chip, but in a box that really can't handle any of the powerful stuff that it would do. And there's a couple sounds on that keyboard that, with a few tweaks and then run through a bunch of pedals, sounds really, really amazing. So we were able to use a lot of those. So we're using these synths to pick up on the fun, the technology and control, the 80s dystopia, all those things together to form the music for the bad guys. The next concept is not really part of any particular group, but it's just an overall aesthetic that has to do with Just Cause franchise. So Just Cause is a game where you are fighting to remove a dictator and liberate a group of people and fighting for this noble just cause, but you're also running a giant cargo plane into an array of satellite dishes and blowing it all up just because it's really fun. So we're looking for a combination of like kind of noble epicness, but also just like that this is some anti-hero grit on one level. So when I say distorted elements, what I really mean is like modern production techniques like side chaining and overdriving things and saturation, ways of making things really big and really gritty to kind of represent Rico and the Just Cause franchise together. All right. So for the Army of Chaos, remember that picture of the army? They were not in uniforms. They had really ragtag, and they were really, really young. So we were looking for ways to portray the Army of Chaos as like a band of outcasts and misfits that were all fighting for their freedom in their own way. And there was a piece of music on the reference playlist I got that was like 80s glam punk. And everything else was like, you know, the stuff that you might hear in a modern blockbuster film or other really awesome video game soundtracks. And then there's this one, like, kind of punk song. And me and my studio partners, we were listening to the playlist and we just did not know what to make of the song. And eventually we kind of came around on it and we're like, you know, this is the DIY punk vibe of the Army of Chaos. This is what would a group of people who were just fighting, all they had, was in this fight, like what kind of music would represent them? And the song on the playlist perfectly did it. So we knew we didn't want to have like actual punk music, guitars and drums and stuff like that in the soundtrack, but if you can get deeper into the punk aesthetic, it's like, well, what is that about? Well, for one thing, it's not particularly well recorded because they didn't have the money to do it. The other thing is that it's maybe not played with the most technical accuracy, but it's played with the most intensity, and you can hear the intensity in the recordings. You can hear how loud the drummer is playing. You can hear how difficult it is maybe to play the fills, things like that. So trying to get into that aesthetic and relate it to our game, we recorded a bunch of Afro-Brazilian rhythms like samba. The one we're hearing now is called Molekulele, but we're not recording them on the drums they were originally written for. We're recording them on bucket percussion. So this is like plastic buckets that you guys play on the street, and pots and pans. Like for shakers, we're using like jars of like popcorn kernels and mac and cheese and things like that, and just kind of putting together this, and then recording them. Not using I have some very good mics at my studio, and we decided to use like SM57s and like spot mics only in some respects to kind of build out the sound of like, well, what if you were trying to play samba rhythms, but you were recording it through this lens of like a punk DIY aesthetic? So that leads directly into the next bit, which is found sounds. Has anybody heard this term before, found sounds? So what we're trying to do here is imagine a lost and forgotten culture and finding the sound of that culture and then bringing it into modern times. So my mentality behind this was, well, what if the Army of Chaos stumbled on an old abandoned recording studio? And in that old abandoned recording studio, there was like an old master tape that was super messed up that they put on an old tape machine that didn't work well, and then sampled it through an old Akai sampler that didn't really work, and then chopped that up and then use that in modern music. So the idea of finding an old performance and then making it new through like sampling production techniques. So we recorded new music, of course, and recorded through like an archival signal chain, tape machines and things like that, and then simulated sampling it, bit crushing and things like that to build out this kind of aesthetic. So we felt that the world of Solis and the lost and forgotten culture of the world would be really well represented by this, and also help because Solis doesn't exist, right? It isn't in Brazil, it isn't in Peru, it's a fictitious island. So if you're trying to build out the sound of fictitious culture, it often helps to create layers of distance. So because we're recording people now playing kind of not the right instruments and not quite the right way through these archival signal chains and then chopping it and sampling it, it allowed me to create some distance, which I think allowed the world of the game to kind of live and breathe on its own. Okay, and finally, organic and natural sounds. So the world of Solis is a beautiful place, and it's raw. It's like there's a lot of kind of big cliffs, there's a big desert, there's some gigantic mountains, dangerous oceans. So it's beautiful, but it's not beautiful in that like hyper real perfect beauty. It's beautiful in that imperfect beauty, that where the harshness kind of even augments the beauty. So we wanted to record instruments for real, but using not auto-tuning, not pitch correcting, not rhythmically correcting it too much, recording off of a click sometimes, and trying to build out this idea of a musical glow that surrounds the world that doesn't really, it's not too clean, it's a little dirty, but within that dirt is like a beautiful thing. All right, so here's all of those 5 special sauces, aesthetics lined up here, and then here's an axis of bad guys, good guys, and what we're fighting for. Right? So the black hand, the bad guys, who are technology and control, are represented by the synths and distorted elements, and the freedom of the people is represented by rhythmic energy. Actually, I think I have a slide for all this. I think I got ahead of myself. Okay, here we all are. I got some arrows. Here come the arrows. Nice. So, okay, just repeating what I said with arrows. Technology control in the black hand is represented by synths and distorted elements. Freedom, which is represented by the army of chaos character, the good guys, is distorted elements, rhythmic energy, and found sounds. And the lost and forgotten culture of Solis is represented by found sounds and organic and natural sounds. So you can see the whole gradient coming together and how it relates to the themes and characters here. So now that we understand the relationship between characters, themes, and music, how does that relate to gameplay? This is the technical special sauce that I talked about before. This is what video games can do that films and television shows generally can't. So first let's take a look at the design pillars from the creative brief. So this is the design pillars. If any game developers are in here, you might know this term, but the idea is that this is the stuff that the entire development team is rallying around to build out the game. So the design pillars of Just Cause 4 were verticality, meaning that the game takes place in three-dimensional space and you move through it at different speeds. Variety, meaning that there's a bunch of different biomes in this game, different types of missions, different types of combat. Destruction, which I talked about before, is the core Just Cause mechanic. So a lot of what you're doing in the game is blowing things up. And then finally, living world, which is the idea that the world should feel alive. It should feel that if you were not playing the game, the world would continue to exist in its own way. So as the game, we started off with this, but as the game kind of came together, it became clear how these game loops related to those design pillars. So the two big game loops of Just Cause 4 and a lot of other games are combat and exploration. But within those loops, there's some variation. In combat, there's open world combat. That's combat that can happen anywhere in the world of the game, meaning it seamlessly moves in and out of like exploration or of a static state. Next is strike combat, which is combat that you've intentionally chosen to get into, either to complete an objective, beat a base, take something over, find like a key component for something you're building. And finally, there's narrative combat or campaign combat, which is the highest intensity. This is where you're moving the story along, and it's a lot more of a linear gameplay experience. On the exploration side, there's diegetic moments, which might be like you're in a town and the world is existing around you. There's ground exploration, which is where you are walking from place to place, which doesn't happen that often in this game, but sometimes you're trying to find something on the ground and you might be walking. And then finally there's flying exploration. I don't know if you guys saw from the video, but the main traversal mechanic in this game is a wingsuit, grappling hook, parachute combination that is how you kind of get around and going from one combat zone to another. It's very, very fun, and that was something that we definitely knew we needed to address musically as a game loop. So going back to our arrows and our various themes and all that stuff, if I add in the game loops, you can now see, it's pretty easy to see how these would relate to the game loops because of what themes and characters are in these parts of the game. So combat relates to the black hand because that's who you're fighting. So when you're in combat, you're going to hear synths and distorted elements and rhythmic energy. Exploration relates to the world of the game. So when you're exploring the world, you're going to hear a little bit of rhythmic energy, but you're going to hear the found sounds and the natural and organic sounds. And finally, diegetic music, which is the music of the people of the game, you're only going to hear the natural and organic sounds. There's actually a radio system in the game, which wasn't part of my purview, but there's a lot of musicians kind of spread out in the game. I know this is a pretty common thing in video games now, but we recorded live samba and bucket drumming and like Peruvian music that was not through any of these lenses that I was talking about before. It was just like a band on the street. So that would be what you might be hearing in these diegetic situations. Okay, but I'm missing an element. we haven't yet addressed the force of nature, Rico stuff at the very top that's overarching on the whole thing. So we have a gradient of characters and themes, but what we don't have is a three-dimensional way of addressing intensity and scale. Right? I talked about the three different types of combat, and right now we don't really have a way of addressing that. So the next question is, how can we support different types of gameplay in terms of character and theme, as we've discussed, but also in terms of intensity and scale, so that we can talk about the force of nature and the different types of combat and all those types of things. So for a final bit of special sauce, we added orchestral music. Let me turn this up a little bit. So that was the music from the tornado that we heard at the beginning. So the orchestra is an easy way of, because of the associative power of an orchestra, it's an easy way of creating scale and raising stakes. And as you can hear, this is not a real orchestra. This is like a fake hyper orchestra that once I realized that we weren't going to do this for real, it kind of opened it up for me, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to write out of range. This is every brass library I have at the same time, you know, combined with one live horn where we needed a bells up sound, so we stuck a 57 into, or 421 into the bell of the horn, and just got pure brassy grit. So writing out of range, writing for instrumentation that could never exist, and finding ways to just make the orchestra push the music as epic as possible so we can create scale. It took me about 6 months to figure that out, by the way, because of remember at the beginning I was talking, or just a little bit ago, I was talking about the playlist, and I got a lot of just, you know, blockbuster cinematic music, which has a lot of orchestra in it. So I was writing blockbuster cinematic music, sounding like Hans Zimmer or something like John Powell, things like that. And it never was quite right. And it took about 6 months before we figured out that we don't really want the orchestra all the time. We need the orchestra to push in certain ways, but it wasn't like as much of a focus of the aesthetic as we originally thought. So back to this graph. Here is our gradient, adaptive gradient of the various special sauces and how they relate to characters and themes. I think by now you guys remember all the characters and themes and how they relate to these. But now we have a second axis where the orchestral music represents the force of nature, which is creating scale and intensity. So now we can represent both characters and themes on one axis and represent the scale of them on the other. And we can relate the gameplay loops to those. We can basically plot the gameplay loops on the graph. So open world combat has synths, distorted elements, rhythmic energy, and some orchestra, not that much. Strike combat, that's the one that you intentionally get into, has a lot more synths, also distorted elements and rhythmic energy, and has a lot more orchestra to represent the higher stakes of strike combat. Campaign combat, remember, that's the big linear story point combat. That has a lot of orchestra, similar to that tornado theme we just listened to, and then the same stuff, but with a little bit more found sounds. On the exploration side, diegetic music has only organic and natural sounds, and nothing else. Ground exploration has found sounds and organic and natural sounds and just the tiniest bit of orchestral stuff. Low stakes for ground exploration, you don't do very much of it. Flying exploration, a little bit higher stakes. You can, as I often do, die when you're doing flying exploration if you grapple into the ground at high speeds. So it's slightly higher stakes, a little bit of orchestra there, but not that much compared to campaign combat. You may notice that there is an empty quadrant here in the upper right. So in what moment in the game might you hear organic and natural sounds and a lot of orchestra? Well, that would be a moment where you would have a very intense emotional moment, but no threat. And that doesn't happen very often in video games, if you think about it. But it does happen in the cinematics. So there might be a reunion between two characters that haven't seen each other in a while, or a big cathartic emotional moment that's expressed not through gameplay, but through a cinematic. And in that moment, you would hear organic and natural sounds and heavy orchestra. Okay, so that's that is the gradient and the two axes. I made a video to show how all this works in action. Fun fact about me, I'm very bad at video games, and that includes Just Cause 4. So what we're going to see right now is me fly in to a combat zone. I'm going to attempt to commandeer a tank. I'm going to miss everything that I shoot at. I'm going to bail on the idea and jump out of the tank. I'm going to almost die, and I'm going to flee as fast as I possibly can and escape. So this is something that happens all the time in Just Cause 4 if you're not good at it. But and I wrote in what kind of music we're hearing in the bottom right as we're going. So there's going to be flying exploration music. There's going to be open world combat. We're going to hear the orchestra come in when I almost die. Then we're going to hear the orchestra leave, or exit rather, when I leave. And then finally we're going to hear ground exploration at the very end. Here we go.
Good against the Black Hand.
So there's a whole nother talk that There's a whole nother talk that we could have on the implementation system that was designed for this, which is very, very complicated. It was done in collaboration with the technical sound designer at Avalanche Studios, but we will have to wait another time for that one. But so much cool stuff in the audio middleware for how that all kind of came together. So I'll just finish up talking about some large form macro adaptive challenges in writing music like this. So first question, how to create a single musical experience out of all these different types of music. It can be very easy for all these disparate elements to kind of fall apart and lose cohesion in the soundtrack. First point I would make is to control instrumentation. So across all these different pieces of music, there were a lot of bamboo flutes that were performed by a friend of mine, Zach Zinger, who's an amazing saxophonist, video game composer in New York City. So the bamboo flutes kind of exist across the soundtrack and kind of tie the whole thing together. There's a lot of instruments that do that. There's a lot of synths that come back in different ways and different configurations that kind of pull your ear in certain ways. And you have to know when you're writing how you're going to use all those things and not overuse them, obviously, but find ways to create cohesion through instrumentation across the whole thing. Next, control your mix. Yes?
How
did you create cohesion with the similar instrument across the whole thing without going against the pre-established themes for
So-
what you have in that graph?
Well, that's why flute was such a good choice for that, because it's organic and natural. It's a found sound because of the way I sampled it. It's, and then it can exist alongside rhythmic energy, and then it can exist into especially sometimes that flute was, 2 octaves down through like an amp and stuff like that, and that definitely has like inside chained and using a lot of distorted elements in that modern production techniques, and it can exist alongside the synths. So it's finding what are the ones that could exist across the gradient. The drums are another one. So the drums kind of can be the bucket percussion exists as a found sound and organic and natural if it's played in a certain way, and also rhythmic energy and also distorted elements, the whole thing. And then the synths are like, well, I was using like a chime. It was the DX8000 has a chime preset in it that we sampled. I sampled all the synths for 2 reasons. One is because my studio, I'm in New York, so we have a very small studio, and we can't all work there at the same time. So we have like a pretty elaborate mirroring syncing system. So what I could do was, I use Logic. I don't know if anybody here has used Logic before, but the live version of Logic is called MainStage, and hidden deep in MainStage is a program that used to exist on its own called AutoSampler. And all it does is basically send MIDI out and record audio in, and you can choose how many notes you want to sample with velocity layers, anything you want to do, and it'll create a Logic EXS sampler that we then would automatically sync across all of our systems and even remotely. So I could be working from my home studio, my buddy could be working in the synth studio and sample something, and it would show up on my computer about 10 minutes after he did it. So there's a chime sound on this DX8000 that we had sampled in through these Korg, I think they're Korg PME pedals from like the 80s. They're like really weird guitar pedals that sound like very strange, but they have like this nasty compression on them that I really like. So we recorded this chime 2 octaves down that with this crazy compression on it, and then like reverb and things like that. And that sound kind of exists across the entire soundtrack as well. Yeah, control your mix. So I know what the loudest delivered, of the 9 hours of delivered mixed audio, I know what the loudest moment is. I also know what the quietest moment is, and I know everything in between, and everything was totally worked out beforehand, and we stuck to it. And because of that, nothing in the soundtrack jumped out too much when we put it all together, and it was a pretty minimal amount of work to create like actual loudness cohesion. Cadence into different types of music. So a lot of people talk about the different, do you want an entire game to be in one key? Do you want a game to be in different keys? Something we found that worked nicely was have related keys where it feels like when you go from one type of music into another, it actually kind of cadences, like it goes maybe from a 4 chord to a 1 chord, or a 5 chord to a 1 chord, or something like that. So it feels like it's continuing on, and it feels like even though the music is different, it feels like it's logically continued into that. So a lot of the exploration music is in A, a lot of the combat music is in D. So that worked out really nicely. When you enter combat, it's like, oh, we've kind of like arrived here, and then when we left, we kind of arrived elsewhere. Understand how your music relates to the entire soundscape. So composers in the room, I'm sure if you do films, people tell you to compose with the sound design on, the dialogue on. You compose with the dialogue in mind and know how your music fits into that. In games, I think it's important to compose with the sound design on as well, so that you know how your music fits into an explosion. Early on in the process, I wrote a piece that was a half step away from the tonic that the sound designer had tuned all the explosions to. And I didn't realize that. He got in touch with me on Slack. He's like, what did you just do? I was like, I don't know, it's an E flat. He's like, no, everything's in D. You got to put it in D. So, knowing that information was really important. And then last but not least, when is music not playing? I think this is super important, and it's hard to tell because you often, I never played Just Cause 4 until I finished, until the game came out. So I didn't know where silence was going to be in this game. I could only take the word of the audio director and the sound designers of how it was going to be used. But it's really important to know sometimes the best solution is just to not have music for something in a certain place. Or Will, you were talking about that at your implementation talk yesterday. It was sometimes in combat, sometimes music, it's actually detracting from other things. So having an understanding of how silence fits into the whole picture is important as well. So the last thing I want to say to you all is thank you for coming. This is me. Please feel free to reach out. I would be happy to talk to any of you on any social media platform. And I think we have about 5 minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Just a moment. Would you mind going back to the slide with your axes?
Oh yeah.
I didn't grab the whole back. I should have.
Which of the?
Where it's the orchestral on the vertical and on the bottom is the range from
Got it.
natural organic to synths.
Okay, it's coming. Stand by. Any other questions? Yeah.
During like this, you were referencing a lot, like sort of forming these axes between the orchestra and all like the different elements that you wanted.
Yeah.
Is this something that you sort of discovered as you were going through composing music, or did you sort of plan all this out before this started?
No, process of discovery. This was not at all. So what I'm showing you now was not worked out beforehand. This is me trying to rationalize what I was doing, and I had documentation about it that I would share with other people on the team. But what I think was worked out was I knew how I was going to represent the characters, and I knew after 6 months or so that I was going to use the orchestra only to create a sense of scale for certain things. But having this like this, I don't think if you're in the mix of something, I think it would be pretty difficult to be rational about it in this way. But I think it was nice after the fact to kind of step back from it and be able to see it all and put it all together in a way that made sense. And now it's really cool because I can look at this and working on next project, I know what this is. I know that eventually something like this might form, but I can trust myself that I can experiment and try out all these different ideas and it'll coalesce down the line. I think that's kind of cool. Yes?
Why was there silence between the transitions in your demonstration video?
Why was there silence between the transitions in the demonstration video? The one...
Like when you parachuted away, like the video would actually say silence.
Oh, mute music.
Yes.
Yeah, so that was like my last point about like when is silence important. So one of those places was to give the player some rest after combat to make sure that the exploration music wouldn't trigger directly after combat music, to let the combat music kind of fade, let the player catch their breath, and then, okay, now is the player going to return to combat? If so, we don't want to start the exploration music yet, but we also don't want to restart the combat music. Or is the player going to continue on exploring and not return to combat? And in that case, you would trigger the exploration music. There was a pretty intricate system on the front, the first mute music, of when you enter a combat zone, when would the music start? And I think it would start depending on who's firing when. That's more on the implementation side, and I don't think I know the answer to exactly why the music starts when it does, but it's like a certain moment in combat will trigger the music if you enter into a previously existing combat zone. If you walk into a town and blow up a car, the bad guys will show up, and when they show up, the music will just start. But if they're already there and they're already fighting, there's like a pretty intricate if-then situation going on. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. Yes?
So diegetic music has become a huge trend lately, and it's been really focused on sort of world building and story driving. But it's also inherently the most complicated thing to produce as a music person because you have to be working with the game designer, you have to be working with the sound director, the plot writer, etc. In your experience, how does that work and how does it differ from the areas where you might have more creative control?
We had a really great time doing diegetic music in the game, and it was because it was so fun to work with so many different people. So what we decided to do was we knew we wanted to have busker groups around the island. That was the audio director. So this will be my last question, if that's okay. The audio director knew that that we wanted to have these groups in the island, and we knew we wanted them to be relatively accurate South American music. So Solis, I actually think I didn't mention, Solis is a fictional, did I mention fictitious island in South America? Okay, good. So we wanted to have as many different combinations of musicians as we could. So we had a 4-person group, and any of those 4 players could play in combination with each other, and the music would kind of work, which is pretty difficult to do, because you can't have somebody just playing along chords, because at some point you might hear just that guitarist playing along chords, and there's no melody, right? So we were like tons of Hocket, like melody shifting between different instruments. So you might hear like this instrument gets 1 bar melody, this instrument gets another, and then in the middle of those, they can't stop playing, because then if there's just them, they'll just be standing there. So they have to kind of play like accompaniment in the different spaces. So it was like a pretty in-depth process of writing that music. Then we went into Avalanche, to the studio, and some of the musicians, the bucket drummer especially, did the capture. He did the mocap himself for that player, and they were able to line it up. So that was really, really cool. And yeah, we talked about where they would be on the island. You know, they're usually in like bars or on the beach and things like that. And we knew the music, we wanted it to be happy. We wanted it to be kind of fun. And then there's one kind of doleful group that exists like in like some of these like kind of these derelict towns and things like that. You might hear this guitar flute duo in those places. So it was a really fun and involved process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, was it your idea for the diegetic music, or did they come to you and say we want diegetic?
It was their idea. The way we did it, the other cool thing about the diegetic music was they're all variations on the main theme of the game, which I thought was a cool idea. So unfortunately, you don't hear the main theme of the game until the very last battle of the game. But you hear it, if you were to walk around the island, you would hear it being played by all these diegetic players. And I was thinking that the main theme is like the forgotten anthem of Solis. So it's like all they found the sheet music to the forgotten anthem, and then all the players in the island are like playing it again as you liberate these towns, and like the musicians come out and play the music, and then finally when you get to the end and you're blowing up the bad guys' final fortress, and then the music plays like as loud as possible. Hopefully that would be like a cathartic moment. So that was a fun idea. But yeah, it was their idea to have, I think in order to compete with other open world games, it's kind of necessary at this point to have diegetic music on some levels, but it was also a really fun thing to do, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to talk after this if anyone has any questions. Thank you.